A child is the very breath, the heartbeat of their parents. For Hollywood stars, that love burns brighter than any spotlight. And for that very reason, the pain when their child is born with a disability or has to battle illness tears the heart even more. Some have walked away from careers at their peak to keep vigil by a hospital bed. Some have signed surgery papers with trembling hands, knowing it could be the last chance, or the final goodbye forever. And some for the rest of their lives would never again hear the beloved words, "Dad" or "Mom." Get your tissues ready because the stories ahead will bring tears to your eyes. Let's begin right now. 1. Sylvester Stallone. When the invincible hero had to kneel before his son's illness. In 1979, Los Angeles shone under the lights of glory. Rocky had just catapulted Sylvester Stallone to the pinnacle of Hollywood, with the press hailing him as the new icon of the era. But amid the cheers, the moment that made Stallone's heart swell with pride wasn't on screen. It was the moment he stepped out of Cedars-Sinai Hospital cradling his newborn son Sergio in his arms. His face then was radiant, like a fighter who had just won the greatest victory of his life, the victory of a father holding his flesh and blood for the first time. In those early years, Sergio's life unfolded in the boundless love of his parents. His hair was as soft as silk, his deep eyes a mirror of his father's, his rare smiles as warm as the morning sun. Stallone often told friends that just opening the door and seeing his son looking at him could erase all the stress and exhaustion from the film set as if they had never existed. Then the first cracks began to appear in their picture of happiness. Sergio rarely responded when called, often withdrew into a corner, patiently lining up toys in perfect rows, avoiding sudden hugs. Sasha Chak, his wife, initially thought he was just reserved. But the afternoons they spent together calling his name dozens of times, only to be met with heavy silence, planted a seed of fear in their hearts. In 1982, at UCLA Medical Center, the doctor delivered the diagnosis into an air thick with tension: severe congenital autism. The sound of the pen scratching the paper echoed ominously in the silent room. Stallone lowered his head, eyes fixed on his shoes, as if the whole world had just collapsed before him. Years later, in an interview with People, he said, "I've been knocked down hundreds of times on screen, but no blow ever hurt as much as that moment." From that instant, the on-screen Rambo stepped into a battle with no applause, no visible opponent to defeat. He scaled back his filming schedule, pouring all his time, energy, and money into therapy for his son. Every speech exercise, every hour of physical therapy, every new method, no matter how unproven, he embraced them as if each fragile chance was the only lifeline. The smallest progress from Sergio became a priceless treasure. One day, after months of silence, he suddenly called out. Dad Stallone burst into tears right there in the therapy room, oblivious to the stares around him. A gentle touch from his son's hand was something he would remember for life. Yet, between these moments came quiet stabs of pain. Many times he stood at a distance, watching his son gaze sadly toward other children playing, the sense of helplessness tightening around his chest. Friends recalled a time when Stallone left the therapy center with shoulders weighed down, his face lowered, as if carrying an overcast sky. Yet, when walking past the photographers, he instantly put on a smile, as if he had just left a successful press conference. Sasha once whispered that Stallone hid his pain deep inside because he knew that once it escaped, he would never be able to contain it again. Over 40 years have passed, and Sergio still lives with the family, needing special care every day. This battle has never had an ending, and Stallone has never stepped away from the front lines. His love is not loud, not scripted, not backed by a triumphant score, but enduring, unyielding, and stronger than any hero he has ever played on screen. Somewhere else, another legendary actress, Elizabeth Taylor, had also spent long nights by her child's hospital bed praying to take on each pain in their place. 2. John Travolta. the seizure that took away his 16-year-old son. John Travolta, a face etched deep into the memories of millions of movie lovers with those mesmerizing dance moves in Saturday Night Fever, the charm of Grease, and the triumphant comeback in Pulp Fiction. On the silver screen, he was the embodiment of a lure of dazzling victories. But behind those bright lights, there was a chapter in his life that, whenever mentioned, made his heart ache, as if a wound had just been torn open. In 1992 in Los Angeles, Jet Travolta let out his first cry. It was the moment John and his wife, actress Kelly Preston, had been waiting for all those years. Appearing on Good Morning America, John once said that when he wrapped his arms tightly around his newborn son, he could feel clearly that from that moment on his life would revolve around a single mission: to protect his son from every harm. The early days of Jet's life were overshadowed by a cruel fate. At just 2 years old, doctors at Cedars-Sinai diagnosed him with Kawasaki disease, a rare condition that could directly attack the heart and other vital organs. Gradually, signs of autism began to appear, accompanied by severe seizures that kept the whole family on constant high alert. Their home in Ocala, Florida, was transformed by John and Kelly into a complete therapy space, a physical therapy room, a play area designed with absolute safety, and a team of nurses on duty around the clock. Kelly once choked up on the Oprah Winfrey Show, saying that just seeing Jet laugh would make all her worries disappear. Amid the tense days, there were still peaceful moments. Intertwined, Jet driving a golf cart with his father under the golden afternoon light, sitting for hours with his mother coloring a picture, or enjoying the sun and breeze together on the beaches of the Bahamas. Yet that peace was as fragile as morning mist. On the morning of January 2, 2009, while the family was vacationing at Old Bahama Bay, the sea breeze was gentle, and the early sunlight was golden. Jet said he wanted to go to the bathroom. Just minutes later, a heavy sound rang out, piercing and chilling. When John and the hotel staff rushed in, the scene before him ripped the breath from his chest. Jet lay motionless on the tiled floor, his head having struck the bathtub hard. This seizure was too violent, sweeping him away like an unstoppable storm. Kelly collapsed to her knees, her voice calling for her son, shattering the air. John clutched his son's gradually cooling body tightly to his chest, shaking him desperately. "Jet, can you hear me? Open your eyes. Please." Everything sank into the merciless silence. Jet was taken to Rand Memorial Hospital, but the doctor's announcement closed every door of hope. 16 years of life ended on what had seemed like a peaceful morning. The news flooded CNN, People, ABC News, but no headline could capture the depth of that pain. Months later, John and Kelly returned to the public eye. In a conversation with Barbara Walters, his tears wouldn't stop his voice breaking as he said that since Jet left, a part of his soul had vanished. He would trade every award, every role, just to hold his son one more time. That emptiness remains forever carved deep into his heart, reminding the world that even at the peak of fame, the loss of a child is the greatest tragedy a human being can endure. And John Travolta is not the only one bearing such a wound. Another Hollywood legend, Sylvester Stallone, also had to face the harsh reality when his son was diagnosed with severe autism, forcing him to step away from the spotlight to walk alongside his child on a challenging journey. 3. Robert Redford. 2 short months to hold his child in his arms. Before the world called Robert Redford a Hollywood legend, he was just a 23-year-old newlywed living with his wife Lola Van Wagenen in a small New York apartment. They didn't have much money, but they had love and the eager anticipation of their first child, the brightest hope for the future that lay ahead. On summer evenings in 1959, Robert sat by the window carefully building a wooden cradle for his baby. He chose white paint, sanding every corner, every edge, afraid those little hands might get scratched. Each time he passed by, he would stop imagining a baby boy lying still, stirring slightly in his sleep as the morning sun kissed his tiny red face through the window. In September, Scott Anthony Redford let out his first cry. Robert remembered vividly the moment his son's tiny hand gripped his finger, a weak grasp yet strong enough to make him tremble. In that moment, he silently promised, "I will protect you, no matter what happens." But fate chose a cruel way to test that vow. Just weeks later, Scott began showing strange signs. The baby cried in short bursts, breathed rapidly, his eyes shut for hours, as if avoiding the light and the world outside. The doctor said it might just be a cold, but Lola felt a chilling unease take hold of her heart. On November 17th, New York was gripped by a biting cold. Robert was at an audition when the phone rang. On the other end, Lola's voice was torn and breaking apart. "Robert, he's not breathing. They're trying." He didn't remember how he left the set, only that when he arrived at the hospital, the emergency room reeked of antiseptic under the harsh white lights. The doctor came out slowly, shaking his head so slowly and heavily it felt like the closing of an entire world. Scott was gone. The cause, sudden infant death syndrome, an invisible enemy that medicine at the time could barely fight. Robert held his son's body already cold. He pressed his cheek to his boy's as if trying to pass his own warmth and breath into him, clinging to even the faintest hope of life. But it was too late. 2 months, that was all the time Scott had on this earth. 2 months too short for a child to know the voice of his father, but long enough to make a man into a father, only to take away what was most precious. Years later, at the height of his Hollywood fame, Robert still mentioned Scott in interviews. In The Guardian, he once said, "There are losses time will never heal. You just learn to live with them. Like a missing part of your body that still always hurts." Outwardly, Robert Redford was the face of strength of defiant characters. But deep down, he was still the father who once sat for hours in a dark room, holding a tiny blanket still scented with his son's milk, silent until dawn blurred in his eyes. For Elizabeth Taylor, I would trade every award, every role, if only it could take away your pain. In 1961, when the world was still spellbound by the beauty of Cleopatra and her legendary violet eyes, Elizabeth Taylor shocked the European press. Not because of a new role, nor a scandalous romance, but because of an image of her inside an orphanage in Munich, Germany, holding in her arms a tiny baby girl wrapped in a cream-colored blanket. The baby's name was Maria Burton, just a few months old. From the very first moment the doctor had placed on Elizabeth's shoulders a cold verdict, Maria was born with congenital hip dysplasia. Without early and continuous surgery, those little legs would never move normally. She would live her life disabled. Eddie Fisher. Elizabeth's husband at the time froze for a moment, but she only tightened her embrace, letting her eyes sink deep into the child's gaze like a silent promise. Later, she told Life, "At that moment, I didn't think about the illness. I only saw a pair of eyes desperately searching for safe arms, and I knew I had to be those arms." On the flight back to Los Angeles, Elizabeth did not sleep for a single moment. Every soft whimper from her daughter made her bend down to kiss her forehead, whispering lullabies between sobs. Passengers on that flight never forgot the sight of a movie star clutching her child to her chest, as if loosening her hold for even a second would make the entire world around her collapse. But Elizabeth's path as a mother was far from lined with roses. As soon as Maria began to walk, waves of hip pain struck, causing the little girl to collapse to the floor many times. Doctors at Cedars-Sinai advised multiple surgeries. Once, while filming Who's Afraid of Virginia, Wolf, Elizabeth received news that Maria needed immediate surgery. She left the set at once, still in costume, rushing to the car with only one thought burning in her mind. I have to be with my child right now." The press often saw Elizabeth leaving film sets in a halo of glamour, but few witnessed her sitting for hours on a cold plastic chair outside the operating room, her hands clenched until they turned white, her eyes fixed on the red sign that read, "Operation in progress." On another occasion, after a surgery that lasted more than 4 hours, Elizabeth walked into the recovery room. Maria lay still, her face pale tubes and IV lines all over her. Elizabeth gently lifted her daughter's tiny hand to her cheek, her voice trembling as if making a vow. "If I had to trade every award, every role, even my career, I would, as long as it means you won't hurt anymore, my Maria." In the years that followed, Maria learned to walk again, slowly, with a limp. But whenever she saw her daughter smile as she walked past the garden in front of their house, Elizabeth knew she had won the most important Oscar of her life. 5. Jean Tierney. The pain and torment of a mother. In the 1940s, Jean Tierney was celebrated in Hollywood as a screen goddess with eyes as deep as an autumn lake, a face so delicate it seemed time itself dared not touch it, and a smile gentle enough to shatter any heart's defenses. But behind the glamour, she lived with a wound she once admitted was a life sentence. "And I will never be pardoned." In 1943, at the peak of her career, Jean had just married the brilliant fashion designer Oleg Cassini. Their happiness was complete when she discovered she was pregnant with their first child. She continued to attend charity events, believing she was doing the right thing, that every handshake, every smile, offered comfort to soldiers far from home during World War II. One evening at the Hollywood canteen, a long line of fans waited for her autograph. Among them was a young woman with a radiant smile, but an unsettling look in her eyes. When her turn came, she suddenly hugged Jean and almost boastfully said, "I escaped from the German measles quarantine just to meet you." Jean smiled and hugged her back, not knowing that moment had planted in her body a disease that would haunt her forever. Weeks later, she developed a fever and a red rash, classic signs of rubella. The doctor warned of high risk to the baby, though he left a small glimmer of hope. Jean cradled her belly, whispering to her unborn child, "We'll get through this together, my love." On October 15, 1943, baby girl Daria Cassini let out a faint cry. But only hours later, the doctor came in with heavy eyes, delivering a diagnosis like a knife. Daria was born deaf, partially blind, and with severe intellectual disabilities. In her memoir, Jean wrote, "I couldn't breathe when I heard it. Everything blurred around me. It felt like I had locked the door to my child's life with my own hands." From that moment, every day was a battle with herself. She replayed every detail of that fateful night, the dim yellow lights, music drifting from the dance hall, the girl's face, the hug, and the words that unknowingly became her child's life sentence. During sleepless nights, she tortured herself. "If only I had stepped back. If only I had refused. My child could have seen the sky, heard the birds." Daria grew up moving between the best doctors in New York and special care centers in California, but no miracle ever came. Eventually, Jean made the heartbreaking decision to place her daughter in long-term care. She called it the second knife in her life. Every visit, she held Daria for as long as possible, telling her about the deep blue of the ocean, the scent of jasmine at night, or the crimson sunset over the Beverly Hills hills. Daria couldn't hear, nor could she fully see, but Jean still spoke, still held her, as if through love alone she could return to her daughter the pieces of sky fate had stolen. She once choked back tears and confessed, "I made millions of people smile, but I was powerless before my own child's smile." Jean Tierney's story became one of Hollywood's most heartbreaking tragedies, a reminder that sometimes a moment that seems harmless can shatter an entire future, and that a mother's pain, once carved deep, will never fade. And in another corner of Hollywood many years later, Another star, Angie Dickinson, would also watch her daughter grow up in a limited world where every day was a challenge just to exist. 6. Angie Dickinson. Her daughter ended her life because the pain was too great. On January 4th, 2007, Los Angeles lay under a cold, heavy fog. At 2 a.m., the shrill ring of the phone sliced through the stillness. Just 3 words rasped out over the line were enough for Angie Dickinson to know. Her world had just collapsed. Her only daughter, Nikki Bacharach, would never come home again. Not because of an accident nor a fatal illness, but because the storms in her mind had finally swept her away. After 40 years of struggling to survive in a world too harsh for such a fragile soul. In the silent house, Angie sat motionless before a wall of photographs. The soft yellow light fell on a frame of a little blonde girl, clutching a doll, eyes half closed from the sun, a smile unfinished. She whispered, her voice crumbling into pieces. "Why did you have to leave like this?" Memories pulled her back to 1966. When Nikki was just a few months old, Angie sensed her daughter was different from other children. She rarely smiled when held her gaze, often drifting into the distance as if lost in a private world no one else could enter. The doctor's diagnosis only confirmed what a mother's heart had already known. Nikki had Asperger's syndrome, a form of autism spectrum disorder, along with poor eyesight. At the time, Asperger's was a vague concept. Beyond the medical challenges, Nikki faced suspicious glances and social exclusion. At the height of her career, Angie was willing to step away from major roles to stay by her daughter's side. She patiently taught her the smallest tasks, from tying shoelaces, recognizing colors, to speaking a full sentence. Each night, she read the same thin book over and over, hoping each word would be the fragile thread that pulled her child closer to the outside world. But 40 years passed, and though she grew older, Nikki lived within a closed circle with few friends, often sinking into depression. Bert Bacharach, Nikki's father, once admitted on television, "She was smart, but the world was too loud and cruel for her." Angie took her from one clinic to another, from one specialist to the next, trying every therapy she heard of, but each time a glimmer of hope appeared, it quickly faded. And then that winter morning took everything away. When she heard Nikki was gone, Angie felt the sky cave in, leaving nothing to hold on to. Speaking to the press, she said only one short sentence, but it carried a lifetime of heartbreak. "My child was never short of love, only of a world gentle enough for her to live in." From that moment on, her eyes always held a cold emptiness time could never fill. Nikki had taken a part of her mother with her forever, a part of her heart that would ache each day knowing that love, no matter how boundless, is sometimes powerless against life's cruelty. Angie knew she wasn't the only one in Hollywood to experience such loss. Decades earlier, another famous father, Roy Rogers, the singing cowboy of America, had also cradled his daughter in his arms, but only for 2 short years before fate took her away. 7. Roy Rogers. The father who lost his daughter at just 2 years old. Mention Roy Rogers, and older generations of Americans immediately picture the singing cowboy riding his horse, trigger across the Wild West, his cheerful voice carried on the prairie winds. But behind the dust and melodies that charmed audiences was a harsh truth. Roy once endured a loss so deep that even time couldn't heal it. In 1950, Roy and his wife, singer Dale Evans, adopted a tiny baby girl, naming her Robin Elizabeth Rogers. On the day they brought Robin home, they called her God's miracle. Yet that miracle came with a hidden cut to the heart. Robin was diagnosed with Down syndrome, a condition surrounded at the time by stigma and isolation. Roy and Dale never saw that as a reason to love her less. On the contrary, they held her on stage, featured her in family photos, ignoring the whispers that they should hide her to protect their reputation. Dale wrote in her memoir, "We knew her life would be short, but every day with her had to be full of love." Robin had eyes as bright as an autumn sky, a smile that lit up a room even on its darkest day. Each morning, Roy held her close, telling her stories about the lands he had traveled, long horseback rides through endless plains and distant mountains, knowing she couldn't yet understand, but hoping his words might still touch her little heart. Then fate struck its hardest blow. Just after Robin turned 2, a severe bout of mumps and pneumonia hit. Her breathing grew shallow, her bright eyes dimmed. And then, in the helpless arms of her parents, she took her last breath. At the burial, Roy stood like a stone statue, hand gripping his cowboy hat tightly. In front of him was a tiny coffin covered in white flowers, so small it could be cradled in one's arms. He didn't sing, didn't speak. He couldn't. Only silent tears fell down the face of the man who had made millions of Americans smile. Each drop fell like the final note of a sorrowful ballad he would carry for the rest of his life. Dale later wrote Angel Unaware, telling Robin's story as that of a little angel sent by God to teach people about love and compassion. The book became a source of comfort for thousands of families with disabled children, but for Roy, it remained the diary of a broken heart. 8. Shaquille O'Neal. The giant's heart breaking beside his son's operating table. Shaquille O'Neal, a name synonymous with backboard-shattering dunks, a towering height of 7'1", and a frame like a fortress. On the court, he was every opponent's nightmare. Off the court, he was the funny giant who made people laugh. But in late 2018, that smile faded, replaced by sleepless nights and fear creeping into every breath. His son, Sharif O'Neal, then 18, and considered one of the brightest prospects in U.S. college basketball, began showing alarming symptoms: fatigue that clung to him, shortness of breath, and erratic heartbeat. A rush of tests returned a chilling verdict: congenital heart defect. The doctors said without immediate open-heart surgery, his life was at risk. Shaq, who had faced roaring crowds and the strongest giants of the NBA, suddenly felt smaller than ever. He told ESPN, "I heard the doctor say it, and it was like someone put a whole building on my chest. My legs couldn't hold me up." On the day of surgery, Sharif lay on the hospital bed, pale and shrunken in the loose green gown. Shaq stood in the hallway, his massive hand covering his face, his shoulders shaking with stifled sobs. He couldn't protect his son from the scalpel, from the thin line between life and death, and that shattered the invincible confidence he once had. The ticking of the clock in the waiting room felt longer than any game he had ever played. Then the operating room door swung open. The surgeon came out smiling softly to announce the surgery was a success. Shaq couldn't speak. He simply rushed in to hug his son as Sharif opened his eyes, his hands trembling as they touched the long scar running down his chest, a scar of survival. It took nearly a year for Sharif to return to the court. The scar remained, but beneath it was a heart saved, and a father who once thought he could never break, now knowing that love was the truest strength. Shaquille O'Neal's fear of nearly losing his son brings to mind another father, Arthur Miller, one of America's greatest playwrights, yet fate was even crueler to him, as his son, born with Down syndrome, spent his life in care, completely apart from the family's embrace. 9. Arthur Miller. The wound he buried until his final breath. Arthur Miller, America's stage genius, author of Death of a Salesman, The Crucible, the man who moved millions with words that laid bare the human condition. But there was one role he never wished to step onto the stage for: the role of a father, carrying a secret no spotlight would ever touch. In 1966, during his marriage to photographer Inga Morath, a baby boy, Daniel Miller, was born. In the delivery room, the doctor announced Down syndrome. At the time, the cruel advice was delivered with unsettling calm: "Put him in an institution. It will be better for everyone." In that moment, between the baby's faint cries and Inga's lost gaze, Miller was forced to sign a decision that would follow him for the rest of his life: to send his son to a facility for disabled children in Connecticut. From then on, Daniel grew up within unfamiliar walls, far from the embrace of his family. In the public eye, the boy barely existed. In interviews, Miller spoke of politics, of art, of his famous romances, but never once mentioned his second son. People thought he had forgotten, but the truth was a silent grief, solid as stone, impossible to break. Those close to him said he still quietly visited his son, carrying picture books and carefully wrapped wooden toys. He would sit by the bed telling Daniel stories about distant lands, about the winter sea, about wind over the prairies. Knowing his son couldn't fully understand, he still spoke just to hear the faint laughter that came whenever his voice touched the boy's ear. But the distance between them was not a few miles of road. It was an ocean of silence Miller could never cross. In notes found after his death, one line tore at the hearts of readers. There are things a father cannot explain, only that he loved his child, but that love was locked behind closed doors. Arthur Miller carried that wound to his grave, a wound born from the social pressures of the time, but also a sentence he had passed on himself. And it remained there, a cold void in the legacy of a man who understood the human heart more than anyone else. 10. Patricia Neal, ready to leave all of Hollywood just to keep her child in her arms. In October 1962, the New York Times unexpectedly printed a small note in its society section: Oscar-winning actress Patricia Neal temporarily withdraws from all film activities for family reasons. The short line revealed nothing, but behind it was a storm of emotion no newspaper could fully capture. Her daughter, Olivia Dahl, just 7 years old, was the joy of Patricia and her husband, writer Roald Dahl. Just days earlier, Olivia had been running through Central Park. Then, one afternoon, she came home with a slight fever. Her mother thought it was just a cold. But as night fell, Olivia suddenly became disoriented, her speech confused, and then she collapsed. The diagnosis from Lenox Hill Hospital was like a sentence encephalitis caused by measles complications, a rare illness that viciously attacks the brain. The Daily News called it the kind of illness that keeps parents holding their breath every hour because the chance of survival is slim. Patricia left the set immediately. No longer the movie star walking the red carpet, she quietly appeared in the hospital corridor with messy hair and an old sweater, clutching a cup of cold coffee. A Life magazine reporter recalled seeing Patricia sit motionless for hours by her daughter's bed, only reaching out to stroke her hair and whisper something no one else could hear. Roald Dahl, instead of writing his usual fairy tales, rooted himself at the hospital, seeking connections with top doctors from New York to London. The Guardian later revealed he had once written a desperate letter to a neurologist in England, asking for any method that might help his daughter recover. The week passed like years. Each time Olivia opened her eyes, Patricia forced a smile, even though her tears were already wet. When the little girl moved her finger for the first time, Roald immediately called family. "She's still here. God kept her with us." Olivia survived the crisis, but Patricia never forgot the feeling of watching her child lie motionless under the cold surgical lights and machines. Years later, in an interview with the Los Angeles Times, she said, "The Oscar sits on the shelf, but Olivia's first hug after waking up was the real prize life gave me." The battle of Patricia and Olivia became one of Hollywood's most touching stories of the 1960s, a reminder that sometimes all the glamour must bow before a mother's love. And in the same way, many decades later, Toni Braxton, the Grammy-winning singer, would embark on a different journey, fighting to pull her son out of the silent world that autism had locked around his childhood. 11. Toni Braxton. Her son did not speak until the age of 4. In the spring of 2005, People magazine published a spread of Toni Braxton dazzling on the red carpet in a glittering dress with a captivating smile. No one that night knew that only hours after leaving the spotlight she would be sitting curled up in a small room, watching her second son, Diesel Kai Braxton Lewis, sit silently in the corner, his eyes drifting to a place far beyond her reach. Her son's silence at first only made Toni mildly concerned. But as months passed without him saying mommy, without smiling, without reacting when she sang lullabies, the abnormality began to weigh heavily on the heart of a woman who lived in the world of sound. A specialist in Los Angeles, after a series of evaluations, delivered the diagnosis autism. He may never communicate like other children, the doctor said, and those words cut into every note in Tony's mind like a knife. The Los Angeles Times later recorded that Tony had put many music projects on hold to devote herself to finding a way for her son. She wandered through therapy centers in California, attended seminars, and spoke with other parents in similar situations. She learned to use picture boards, color cards, short songs, and patient eye contact to break down each brick in the wall of silence. There were days when Tony sat for hours in front of her son, waiting for even the briefest glance or the faintest movement of his lips. "I don't care how long it takes. As long as I get a signal from him, I'll keep going," she said in an interview with Access Hollywood. Then a small miracle happened. The first time Diesel spoke imperfect but clear enough, Tony burst into tears. From one word came two, then full sentences. In 2018, Tony proudly announced that her son not only communicated well, but had also signed a modeling contract, walking the runway with a confident smile, a testament that a mother's love and perseverance can change destiny itself. Looking back, Tony called that time a silent battle and affirmed, "I've lost many things in life, money, fame, opportunities, but I will never lose my child." Tony's story reminded the public of another family who had faced a similar trial, Beyoncé and Jay-Z, when they confronted hearing issues with Blue Ivy from the earliest years of her life. 12. Beyoncé and Jay-Z. The journey to reclaim their daughter's angelic voice. They are the embodiment of perfection. Beyoncé, the queen of the stage with a powerful voice and unforgettable performances. Jay-Z, the rap legend and music mogul. On the red carpet, they shine as though nothing could ever touch them. But behind the smiles in front of the cameras, the Carter family once endured months that neither money nor fame could ease. When Blue Ivy had just turned 4, Beyoncé noticed something was wrong. The little girl wouldn't turn when her mother called from a short distance, or she would frown when hearing music at higher frequencies. At first, the family thought it was just a child's distraction. But a hearing test at an audiology clinic in New York ended with words Beyoncé would never forget. "Your daughter has a hearing problem. If we don't intervene soon, her ability to hear and speak will be permanently affected." It was the moment Beyoncé's heart sank. Sound wasn't just work, it was the lifeblood of her family. The thought of her daughter living in a world without melodies, without applause, nearly took her breath away. From that day, the couple's schedules changed completely. Beyoncé put many projects on hold, spending hours each day sitting close to her daughter, singing slow, repeated phrases so Blue Ivy could focus on hearing and imitating them. Jay-Z, even during international tours, always brought his daughter along so as not to miss a single therapy session. Billboard once wrote that they turned every hotel room into a mini sound training room where guitar strums rhythmic claps, and the mother's voice blended with the child's laughter. The first months were exhausting and filled with tears. In some sessions, Blue Ivy stayed silent for tens of minutes, staring out the window. But Beyoncé stayed patient, placing her hand over her daughter's and whispering, "I'm here. Listen to me." Slowly, small responses appeared, a glance toward her mother when music played, a slight nod when her name was called. And then the little voice began to sing, trembling, but so beautiful it made both parents burst into tears. In 2021, at just 9 years old, Blue Ivy stepped onto the stage to accept a Grammy, becoming the youngest artist in history to win the award. The pure voice echoing through the hall erased every memory of those fearful months. For Beyoncé and Jay-Z, it wasn't just a moment of glory, it was proof that love and persistence can bring a voice back from the edge of silence. And that story recalls another father from old Hollywood, Lloyd Nolan, who faced a similar pain when raising one of the first children in the United States ever to be diagnosed with autism at a time when the world knew almost nothing about the condition. 13. Lloyd Nolan. His son was among the first diagnosed autism cases in America. In the mid-20th century, when America didn't even know what to call the condition, Lloyd Nolan was stunned to learn that his son, Jay Nolan, was among the very first officially diagnosed cases of autism. It wasn't just a medical conclusion, it was like an unfamiliar sentence hanging overhead, one no one could explain and no one knew how to handle. At that time, the word autism appeared only in a handful of thin research papers. Medicine hadn't found a cause, and society hardly understood or accepted it. The Nolan family had no guidebook, no support network, no internet to search for answers. Instead, they received cruel advice from some doctors. You should send the boy to a specialized institution. There, he'll be less of a burden on the family. Lloyd, who had played dozens of strong men on screen, now stood at a crossroads in real life. To follow that advice meant leaving his son forever. To stay meant stepping into uncharted territory where every day would be a new experiment. He chose the unknown. That choice completely changed Lloyd's life. He turned down many film contracts, missed lucrative opportunities just to stay home patiently, teaching Jay skills that came naturally to other children, looking into someone's eyes, lifting a spoon to eat stacking blocks into shapes. Some days Jay would sit still for hours, staring into space. Lloyd would sit beside him, silently placing a hand on his shoulder as an unspoken promise. "I'm not leaving you." When Jay finally spoke his first words, Lloyd felt as though he had just heard the most beautiful music of his life. Not scripted lines, not the applause of an audience, but the voice of the son he had feared losing forever. Years later, newspapers like the Los Angeles Times mentioned him not only as one of Hollywood's most dependable actors, but also as a steadfast father ahead of his time. But Lloyd didn't stop at his own family. In a society that almost refused to acknowledge the existence of autistic children, he stepped forward using his voice and his position to urge the government and community to take notice. He advocated for the creation of special education programs, helping to lay the first stones on a path that millions of American families would later walk. When he died in 1985, friends remembered Lloyd Nolan not just for his many films, but as a symbol of fatherly love that defied all barriers. For in a world unready to accept his son, Lloyd chose to hold the boy close and never let go. You've just heard the stories behind the spotlight where Hollywood legends were not only stars, but also mothers and fathers who endured the deepest pain for their disabled or ill children. They sacrificed, persevered, and loved their children with all their hearts, despite every loss. And you, what do you think helped them stand tall against such harsh losses? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If these stories touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the